Sometimes the mountains kill quickly. Sometimes slowly. But this story became a legend not because of the deaths, but because of what happened after, when one newspaper article turned the tragedy into a mystery and the survivor into a suspect. Poland, August 3, 1925. The Kaznicza family is spending their vacation in Zakopane and decides to go for a hike in the Tatra Mountains. The head of the family is Kazimierz Kaczynska, a 42-year-old prosecutor from Warsaw. With him are his wife, Zofia, and their 12-year-old son, Wacław. They had been to the mountains before, but they could not be called alpinists or even experienced hikers. They were an ordinary urban family who decided to have an active vacation. The destination of the route was the ice pass in the Slovak Tatras, which at the time were still part of Czechoslovakia.
The plan was simple. Set out from the town of Stary Smokovec, walk to the 5 lakes, where there is a shelter for rest, then ascend to the pass, descend into the Jaworova Dolina Valley, and return to Zakopane. A circular route with no overnight stay. Long, tiring, but not technically difficult. It only required endurance and perseverance. Daylight in August is still quite long, so if basic safety rules were followed, everything should have ended well. Kazimierz studied the map the evening before, sitting in the hotel by the light of a kerosene lamp. The route looked straightforward. The change in elevation was significant, but there were no technical sections. Zofia packed a thermos of hot tea, sandwiches, and several chocolate bars. Wacław checked his new boots, stiff, not yet broken in, but sturdy. Around 6 in the morning, the family sets out from Stary Smokovec. The air is cool, smelling of pine resin and damp earth. For an average but experienced tourist, this route takes about 11 hours. For the Kaznicza family, it would likely be longer. The weather that day was awful from the very beginning. Low clouds clung to the peaks, a fine, persistent rain was falling, and a strong wind bent the juniper bushes. The first few kilometers are easy. The trail is well trodden, marked, and wide. Kazimierz walks ahead, occasionally turning back to check on his wife and son. Zofia moves steadily, breathing calmly. Wacław lags a little behind. The boots are pinching after all, but the boy tries not to complain. As they ascend, the trail narrows, and the stones underfoot become slippery from the rain. By 11 in the morning, the family finally reaches the Rycholna hut, the point from which the assault on the ice pass begins. Everyone is soaked and tired. Kazimierz takes off his glasses and wipes them with a handkerchief. The lenses are still foggy with droplets. Zofia pours tea from the thermos. Wacław sits on a bench by the entrance and pulls off his boots. There is a red spot on his heel, a blister forming. Inside the hut are 4 young alpinists. They have recently descended from the mountains and are now waiting for the weather to improve before returning to Zakopane. Their planned return route was the same as the Kaczynska families, over the ice pass. The guys are sitting by the stove, drying their socks and exchanging jokes. On the table lie a map, carabiners, and a coil of rope. These alpinists were Jan Alfred Szczepanski, 23 years old, tall, wiry, with sharp features. At the time of the events, he had only been climbing for 2 years, but he would go on to become a famous mountaineer and participate in numerous expeditions in the Tatras, the Alps, and the Andes. His brother, Alfred Szczepanski, 17, also a novice, quieter, more cautious. Stanislav Zaremba, 22, despite his age, the most experienced in the group. Stocky, with broad shoulders, accustomed to taking responsibility. And finally, Richard Wasserberger, 21, a novice alpinist and a student at the Faculty of Philosophy at Jagiellonian University. He turned out to be the most sociable. He quickly struck up a conversation with the Kaznisha family, asked about their plans, and offered hot tea from his mug. Kazimir understands that the most difficult part of the journey lies ahead. He sees the wind tearing at the clouds over the pass and hears a roar in the cliffs. He asks the alpinists to go with them. According to another version, it was Wasserberger who suggested the family join them to cross the pass together, saying it would be safer and more fun. But it was clear that not all the young men were happy about dragging along three amateurs, especially with a child. Jan Szczepański later claimed it was Wasserberger's idea and that he insisted on taking responsibility for the new acquaintances himself.
Zaremba remained silent, but his gaze was eloquent, as if to say, they were an unnecessary burden. One way or another, at 11:30, they all leave the shelter. The rain has intensified. The wind now blows in their faces, whipping and cold. The family moves very slowly and is clearly holding the young men back. The alpinists walk with slight irritation, stopping to wait, then exchanging glances. Kazimierz, wearing glasses, constantly being drenched by rain, has to stop repeatedly to wipe them. The lenses fog up from the inside, and droplets run down the outside. He squints, trying to make out the trail. Zofia stays close to her son, supporting him by the elbow when the stones underfoot become particularly slippery. The rain intensifies. The trail turns into a stream. Water flows over the rocks, forming small waterfalls. Václav slips, grabs onto a rock, and scrapes his palm. Zofia takes out a handkerchief and bandages the boy's hand. The alpinists no longer hide their impatience. Zaremba looks at his watch. Time is running out. But the group, in full, still reaches the highest lake in the Tatras, which is at an altitude of 2,057 meters, almost at the foot of the pass. The water in the lake is dark, almost black, rippled by the wind. The shores are bare, without vegetation, only rocks, lichen, and narrow strips of snow in the crevices. The air here is already different, thin, cold, smelling of wet stone and ozone. By this point, the alpinists are completely disenchanted with the idea of being nannies for random companions. They step aside and begin discussing something among themselves. Their voices are muffled, but Kazimierz still hears fragments of their conversation. They suggest leaving one of them behind to accompany the tourists, while the others go over the pass at a normal pace. They even prepare to draw lots. Zaremba takes a coin out of his pocket. But Wasserberger, who had started it all, volunteers. He says calmly, without any drama, "I'll stay. You go." His three companions exchange glances, shrug, put on their backpacks, and disappear over the pass. Their silhouettes quickly dissolve in the low clouds. The Kuznitska family and Wasserberger begin the ascent. They move ever more slowly. The trail here is almost vertical, requiring them to cling to ledges with their hands. The rocks are sharp, cold, and wet. The wind has long since become a hurricane, roaring in their ears, knocking the breath out of them, pushing them from behind. The rain has turned to hail. Small, icy pellets strike their faces and get stuck in the folds of their clothing. Kazimierz feels his fingers going numb. Zofia wraps a scarf around Václav's head, but the boy is still shivering. They only reach the pass at 3:30, which is definitely too late.
The sun is already setting, though it's not visible through the clouds. Everyone is exhausted to the limit. 12-year-old Václav complains of feeling unwell. He says he's dizzy and nauseous. Kazimierz can barely move his legs, breathing heavily with a wheeze. Zofia is holding up best. She is 10 years younger than her husband and more accustomed to physical exertion. On the pass itself, the wind reaches such a force that it's impossible to stand up straight. They have to literally crawl, clinging to the rocks to avoid being blown into the abyss. Wasserberger shouts something, but the words are unintelligible. The wind drowns everything out. He points his hand downwards, as if to say, "We need to descend, it will be calmer there." Hoping it will indeed be easier to breathe below, they try to get off the pass as quickly as possible. The descent is steep and slippery. The rocks underfoot wobble and crumble downwards with a dull thud. But at an altitude of 1,880 meters, the boy becomes so weak he cannot walk on his own. His legs give way, his gaze clouds over. He sits on a rock, lowering his head to his knees. Zofia shakes him by the shoulders, but Václav only shakes his head. He has to be carried. Wasserberger picks up the teenager, drapes his arm over his own shoulder, and puts an arm around his waist. The mother takes her son's backpack, heavy, soaked through, its straps cutting into her shoulders. A few minutes later, Kazimierz sits down on a rock and also declares that he can go no further. His voice is weak, his breathing shallow. His face is gray, his lips bluish. He leans on his knees, trying to catch his breath, but there doesn't seem to be enough air. The climax comes catastrophically fast. Zofia is seized with terror. She sees her husband slump down, his eyes turning glassy. She begs Wasserberger for help, shouting, grabbing his sleeve. But he, having spent his last strength helping the family, replies hoarsely, through clenched teeth, "I feel very bad too. I would help with all my heart, but now you will have to manage on your own." Under the hurricane-force wind, Zofia now leads her son and the exhausted Wasserberger to the nearest shelter behind a boulder. It's a small crevice between two huge rocks. The wind is slightly weaker here, and they can at least sit down. She gives them some chocolate. Breaking the bar with trembling hands, she pushes pieces into the boy's mouth. She takes a flask of cognac from her backpack and gives each a sip. Remember this moment, it will become key later on. Immediately after this, the woman hurries to her husband, who was left on the trail about 30 meters above. She wants to drag him to the shelter to help him descend. She climbs back up, clinging to the rocks, gasping for breath. But when she returns, Kazimierz is already lying among the rocks with no signs of life. He had slid off the trail, fallen onto his side, one arm outstretched. His eyes are open but unseeing. Zofia falls to her knees beside him, shakes him by the shoulders, calls his name. Nothing. In tears, she rushes back to the boulder to call Wasserberger for help, and she sees something truly horrifying. In the shadow of the large rock lies her lifeless son. He had slid down the slope, probably tried to stand up, to take a few steps, and fell. His face is pale, his lips blue. A few meters below lies the young alpinist with a shattered head. Apparently, he also tried to get up, slipped, and hit a rock. The blood on the rocks is already being washed away by the rain. Both are dead. In 15 minutes, 3 people die before the woman's eyes. In a state of shock, Zofia doesn't even try to descend. Logic shuts down, leaving only a stupor. For the entire night, she walks from one body to another, first to her husband, then to her son, then to Wasserberger. She tries to cover them with clothes, to adjust their collars, to close their eyes. She speaks to them as if they were alive. The wind does not subside. The rain turns to snow, then back to rain.
The temperature drops even lower. The woman shivers, her teeth chattering, but she does not leave. Apparently, she is waiting for death to take her too. She remains among the dead for 2 days. She doesn't eat or drink. She sits on a rock, hugging her knees, rocking back and forth. Sometimes she stands up, takes a few steps, and sits down again. Her thoughts are jumbled. Reality is a blur. Only on the morning of August 5th, 1925, when the wind finally dies down and the first rays of sun appear, does she descend into the valley. She moves slowly, stumbling, falling, getting back up. In the valley, she meets Mariusz Zaruski, a local guide leading a group of tourists. She tells him what happened, haltingly, with pauses, in a toneless voice. He quickly organizes a search operation and sends a messenger to Zakopane. On August 5th, rescuers find the bodies. They go up with stretchers, ropes, and blankets. They find Kazimierz first. He is lying just as Zofia left him. Then Václav and Wasserberger, a little lower down the slope. On the 6th, all three are transported to Zakopane. The bodies are placed in the morgue at the local hospital. It would seem the story was over. Another unfortunate accident in the mountains due to bad weather and insufficient preparation. Such things happen every year. People overestimate their abilities, underestimate the mountains, and get trapped by the weather. But suddenly, the story enters a completely new phase. On August 8th, that is, the day after the bodies were brought down, a note titled "3 New Victims of the Tatras" appears in a Polish newspaper. It is short, a quarter of a page, with no photographs. It reads something like this. News arrived from Zakopane today that on the ice pass, on the Czech side, Supreme Court prosecutor Kasznitsa, along with his son, and one unknown person, fell victim to the mountains. They were found dead. It is not yet specified whether death resulted from a fall or from freezing. Details are absent. Even Wasserberger's name is not mentioned. And this is a very interesting detail. He isn't there because his companions, who had descended to Zakopane, had not reported him missing, even though the young man had been gone for several days. They returned to the city, checked into a hotel, changed into dry clothes, and kept silent. Maybe they hoped Wasserberger would descend on his own. Maybe they just didn't know what to do. On August 8th, another note is published. This one includes Wasserberger's name and mentions his student status. It states that the prosecutor's wife, by a happy coincidence, escaped her husband's fate. The tone is neutral, without insinuation. But the key article is published on August 11th. It is titled, "The Mystery of the Deaths of 3 People on the Ice Pass. Public opinion demands a full explanation of this matter." The title itself is intriguing. Not tragedy, but mystery. Not an accident, but demands an explanation. In this article, the story is presented with a mass of details. The author quotes statements from the Kasznitsa family and Wasserberger. Where he got them is unclear, since all 3 are dead, and Zofia had not yet given any testimony. It describes how the two groups split up, how the Alpinists abandoned the family. It reconstructs the course of events in detail, with times, altitudes, and weather conditions. But the most interesting thing is that the text contains one mysterious detail. The author unequivocally implies that Zofia Kaznitsa was to blame for the tragedy, alleging that she gave her companions poisoned cognac. This same author claims that the entire family were experienced tourists with significant mountain experience, although this is completely untrue. And he calls any arguments that the accident occurred due to weather conditions absurd, as if to say experienced people don't just die in the mountains, so it must have been something else. And this article is the key. It turns an ordinary accident into an urban legend, a myth, with a huge number of conspiracy theories that would plague the life of the survivor, Zofia Kaznitsa, for years to come. The text is picked up by other newspapers, acquiring new details, conjectures, and rumors. This article was written by someone named L. Shah, the author signed with initials. But now, thanks to archives, it is easy to find out that his name was Ludwik Szczepanski. He was none other than the father of the two young alpinists who had left their companion and a family to die in the mountains. Ludwik was a well-known journalist in Krakow, writing about sports and mountaineering. He had connections, authority, and access to the press. Obviously, if the truth had come out, the alpinists' reputation would have been destroyed. Jan and Alfred Szczepanski were young, promising, with their careers ahead of them. And here was such a stain. They had abandoned a companion. They failed to report him missing. They returned to the city and kept silent. This could have cost them everything. The Szczepanski brothers, their father, the rescuers, they all knew perfectly well that the weather conditions that day were extreme. Meteorologists would later confirm hurricane-force winds, near-zero temperatures, hypoxia. That the Kaznitsa family were not experienced tourists, but ordinary amateurs who had set out on a route that was beyond their capabilities. And Ludwik Szczepanski deliberately deflects public attention from his sons, hinting that a treacherous poisoner was to blame for everything. He creates a conspiracy where there is none. Of course, the public eagerly embraces such a vivid version. The construction of numerous conspiracy theories begins. Newspapers publish letters from readers with new suggestions. Someone remembers seeing the prosecutor in a restaurant with an unknown woman. Someone else claims that Zofia was seen in a pharmacy buying suspicious substances. And no one remembers the Szczepanski brothers anymore. They dissolve into the information noise. This wretched journalist was the first to suggest that the cognac the woman gave her companions was poisoned. He writes in plain text, "It cannot be ruled out that the drink contained a substance that causes cardiac paralysis." But the autopsy showed nothing of the sort. And Szczepanski knew these results perfectly well. He had connections in the police and had gained access to the autopsy report even before publishing his article. But that didn't stop him. The text spawned countless conspiracy theories and rumors that are alive to this day. Of course, the theory immediately arose that Zofia had coolly poisoned 3 people to get rid of her husband and receive the inheritance. The reasoning was that she had long wanted a divorce. But in Catholic Poland of the 1920s, a divorce was a scandal, a loss of status. But this way, a widow, she would evoke sympathy, receive a pension, the house, the savings. Then came the theory of a political assassination.
The cognac was supposedly a gift the prosecutor had received from a colleague or client, and it had been poisoned by his enemies. And Zofia knew nothing about it, simply gave her husband a drink, and unwittingly became the instrument of someone else's crime. This version was supported by those who knew about Kazimier's cases. He had indeed handled several high-profile trials and made enemies. And there were many more versions, down to the most mystical and insane. Some spoke of a curse of the mountains, of the spirits of the Tatras who do not tolerate outsiders. Others claimed there was an anomalous zone on the pass where people lose consciousness and die for no apparent reason. One occultist even wrote an article about how the Kashnika family had violated an ancient prohibition and were punished by higher powers. But let's return to 1925. The autopsy was performed on August 6th, the day after the bodies were brought to Zakopane. It was conducted by Dr. Marian Sakiekev from Krakow, an experienced forensic expert who had worked with the bodies of alpinists for years. Here is his conclusion, quoted almost verbatim. The deaths of all three were not caused by the consequences of violent actions by third parties. In particular, they were not the result of poisoning. Analysis of the blood, stomach contents, and internal organs revealed no presence of any toxic substances. The cause of death, as the doctor writes, was paralysis of the heart, resulting from exhaustion due to the difficulties of hiking in very unfavorable weather conditions. Furthermore, anatomical changes predisposing them to such an outcome were observed in their hearts. Each of the deceased had a significantly enlarged heart and serious defects in their circulatory system. In Kazimir, the walls of the heart were thickened and the valves worked improperly, typical signs of chronic heart failure. He also suffered from stomach and gallbladder problems. The autopsy revealed ulcerative lesions and inflammation. And Václav was found to have active tuberculosis. His lungs had multiple lesions, which explains his shortness of breath and weakness. He also had heart problems, a congenital defect that his parents may not have known about. The doctor continues, "The fatigue of the heart muscle occurred simultaneously with the fatigue of the muscles in the limbs and torso. The body had exhausted all its reserves. Under conditions of hypoxia, hypothermia, and extreme physical exertion, the heart simply stopped." He concludes that even the death of Wasserberger, a young, physically strong man, is not strange under such conditions. Prolonged exposure to hurricane-force winds, lack of oxygen, hypothermia, stress, all this could lead to cardiac arrest even in a healthy person, especially since Mr. Wasserberger was carrying a teenager, which multiplied the load many times over. And it must be said that the weather conditions that day were truly nightmarish. Observations from the meteorological station in Zakopane state that the wind speed at that altitude could have reached 120 kilometers per hour, a powerful hurricane comparable to tropical storms. The air temperature dropped to 0 degrees Celsius, and with wind chill, it felt like -15. The tourists were wearing summer clothes, light jackets, cotton shirts. I remind you, it was August, and they were not expecting such conditions. Here is what meteorologist Apollon Ushival, who was later brought into the investigation, thinks about it. A vacuum zone could have formed, which occurs in such strong winds. The air is essentially sucked out beyond the hurricane, making it difficult to breathe. This causes hypoxia, oxygen starvation, and a sharp deterioration in well-being. A person begins to suffocate, the heart beats faster, but there is still not enough oxygen.
Panic sets in, followed by loss of consciousness. The ice pass is a unique place from a meteorological point of view. The west wind here meets no obstacles. All the peaks to the west are lower than the pass. This creates a wind tunnel effect. In addition, on jagged ridges, the strongest wind blows in crevices and narrow passages, where it takes the form of a funnel and accelerates even more. Even experienced alpinists avoid this pass in bad weather. Descending in altitude doesn't help much either. The valley is a large basin through which the wind blows without obstruction. This means several more hours of shortness of breath, hypoxia, and hypothermia, which not everyone can survive, especially people with heart conditions. However, the conspiracy theorists could no longer be stopped. The life of the survivor, Zofia, turned into a living hell. She was, of course, not officially charged. There was no evidence, and the autopsy showed natural causes of death. But the talk and rumors behind her back created colossal public pressure. She couldn't go outside without people whispering behind her back. In stores, clerks refused to serve her. Neighbors crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her. Children taunted her, "Poisoner, poisoner." Someone wrote "murderer" in charcoal on her front door. Threatening letters arrived almost daily. Zofia tried to give interviews to explain what had really happened, but her words were either ignored or twisted beyond recognition. One newspaper wrote, "Mrs. Kasnitsa claims the weather killed her husband, but does the weather pour the cognac?" Another quoted her in a way that was the exact opposite of what she said, turning her justifications into an indirect confession. According to relatives, the woman died shortly after these events. She did not live even a year. The official cause of death was heart failure, but her loved ones said she simply broke under the weight of the accusations. She stopped eating, sleeping, and leaving the house. She would sit by the window, staring into space. And one morning, she was found dead in her chair, quietly, without a struggle, as if she had simply fallen asleep. This is an old, convoluted, and very dark story. A story of how a tragedy is turned into a sensation, how facts are drowned in rumors, and how a survivor becomes guilty simply for having survived.